Well, nice to see everyone, and nice to know that people are online. That's great. I'm not an expert on higher education or research and science in Africa. I do look at research and science worldwide, and that's my starting point. So for me, this preparing the presentation has been a good learning experience, and being at this seminar is a good learning experience. Sharing that with you is great. So what I'll do is talk about sort of, I suppose, what you broadly call global science, but it includes social science and some humanities as well in the data. And then talk about the regional position of African countries as part of that discussion, and that'll occupy the sort of last part of the presentation when I go through, as I go through. Please feel free to interrupt if you want to ask any questions, or sort of engage in dialogue around particular things that are appearing on the screen. I think I've probably got about 25 minutes of talk, but we can take that over a longer period if that's necessary. So, okay, this is what I want to talk about. The way in which the global epistemic environment, I suppose 80% university research, we're talking about 20% research in other institutions, whether they're in government laboratories or corporate labs or in other places, even government departments sometimes. But we're talking about published work, published science, what's on the record. And that whole worldwide environment is really changing by the year when you're looking at the data. Of course, it depends which data you're looking at, and I'll come to that as we go. But it's really striking how, I suppose, dynamic this whole area is now, and it's because of the entry of more and more non-traditional science countries into science, non-traditional university systems into university systems, and so on. And so it's essentially a process of the world broadening out from the Euro-American to everywhere else, but not on an even basis, not on an equal basis. We'll come to that. So I'll talk about the shape of the overall global network and output. I'll talk about the dynamic element, which is the rise of East Asia, and then say, okay, what are we going to do about, what are we going to say about the rest of the world, which is a lot of the world, of course. South Asia, West Asia, Africa, Latin America, Central Asia, and perhaps, I suppose, Russia. And then look at what the data tell us about the rest of the world. And in doing so, look at what databases we're using and how the choice of database fundamentally affects our perception. And there's a definite preference here for more inclusive databases, which tell us more of what's going on outside the US and Western Europe. And that changes the picture a lot when you look at it, things with that broader set of data. Then I'll talk about the role of the regional in worldwide science, which is very important in some parts of the world and less instrumental in others, and then get to Africa. So, starting point, as my students will recall, because I always use this slide in my teaching, the starting point for understanding the world as it is colonialism. I mean, it's overwhelmingly the most important fact of our contemporary world is European aggressive, rapacious, exploitative, conquering European colonialism between 1492 and until now, really. If you look at Gaza, for example, it's a settler state. Basically, it's another European enclave in a non-European world. I suppose the 20th century is a slow process of the beginning of unwinding that, but it still was rolling out too at the same time in some respects. And the influence of colonialism and colonial relationships in the economy, politics, society, culture, of course, perhaps more long-lasting than military or even economic exploitation. But state building outside the Euro-American world really begins to take, I suppose, gather pace after 1945, after the founding of the UN, with the principle of self-determination as a central principle. The UN was different. It did change things. And the 1945 settlement reflected the fact that it wasn't just American controlled. It was a deal between the Soviet Union and the US and the other powers who come out of the Second World War victoriously. And that was plurality of systems. And that was before the Cold War. So the UN 1945 is a kind of decolonizing moment, the beginning, I think, of a larger process of decolonization. But of course, a long way to run, and only the beginnings. And the vicissitudes of 1945 to 2026. I mean, there's been ebbs and flows, and there was the collapse of the Soviet Union and the astonishing US hegemony after 1990, that 10, 15 years where US seemed to be absolutely dominant as a power in every respect, was a kind of neo-imperialism, neo-colonialism of a sort too. And so it's been a slow process, but it continues. And in the end, I think it was that period between 1990 and 2010, that period of globalization at its height, which actually laid the basis for the world we now have in many ways, because it released state building and economy building outside the Euro-American West to a new extent. And you saw in so-called Global South, about half of the Global South uplifts substantially in that 20-year period and continues to do so after 2010. Not just China, and not even just India, but lots of other parts of the world. And I'll get to some of the data on that. But not all of the Global South, so-called, lifts in that period. So some of it does and some of it doesn't. But it is the beginning of the breaking up of the colonial world. And if you go look at the global science data, and we've only got the worst databases in terms of bias, which is, for the early period, for the pre-2000 period, we've only really got Web of Science, which is so Eurocentric and Euro-American centric. But there was very little science outside North America, Europe, the European settler states, this is Australia, New Zealand, Israel, Canada, and so on, and Japan and Russia. Beyond there, not much at all. How it's changed. It's completely changed since then. And you can see the growth of the rest of the world here in the graph. The boom of science output in many countries reflects it. And of course, the great growth of China. So you see that the US is producing a bit more than it did at the beginning of the period of the data, which is 1996, but not a lot more. UK is virtually unchanged. Germany is virtually unchanged, slight increases. Japan is actually fell for it. Its science system got smaller for a while, and then basically it's been almost constant right through the period. But there's India and the rest of the world, which is Latin America and most of Asia and so on, Central Asia, and also Russia. Though Russia has not been a force for growth in science. It's been more or less constant, or it's dipped and then gone up again. But this is the really important story. It's the non-West, the march of the non-West. And the next slide shows that more crisply, but look at some detail here. China, 19-year period, multiplies science output by 10 times. This is genuine, most of it anyway. This is, I suppose, this is Scopus data, so it's not Web of Science. It's a bit better. It's a bit more inclusive. It's not as good as the database, which I'll talk about in a minute. But anyway, it shows this massive growth. And in India, for all its complications and problems, India, with its, I suppose, weak union government in a lot of ways, policy-wise, it's highly regional. It's, the language environment extremely plural. And universities, the public universities, underfunded, over-politicized in a bad way. It's not working very well. Private universities, are just pursuing their own interests. Some of them do research on scale, but most of them don't. But still, India's become a player in global science. And South Korea, of course, great success story as a nation, poorest nation in Asia in 1960, and education being really central to its building of a successful society, economy, and culture. Now, in a lot of ways, a good place to live, a very successful society, and although far too competitive in secondary education at the point of entry to universities. This is great pathology of South Korea. Brazil, a lot of work done in industry-related research centres at institutes outside the university system, and some very big universities in terms of science. Iran, see, people don't talk about Iran in the West in this way, but major growth of higher education participation, major growth of science, and significant infrastructure. And an interesting thing about Iran is that government money is focused on strategic science, physical sciences, nuclear, all those areas. But there's a broad-based university system with a range of disciplines, a healthy culture in lots of ways. And Iran is, if the politics sorts, it's poised to play quite a big role, constructive role in the world because of this cultural capability and a deep well of culture going back 2,600 years or thereabouts. It's a really important civilization, that civilization. Indonesia, well, I used to be in Australia, it's close by, and Indonesia was doing no science. The 387 in 2003, they're people who would be offshore in the US, Europe, doing their doctorates and co-publishing with their supervisors. But now Indonesia has an indigenous science system, and in fact, it's got a performative culture where people are pumping out papers left, right, and centre, which is not very healthy. But there's some good work coming out too. So as a journal editor, I see both, both the rubbish and the good stuff, and that's what's happening in most emerging systems. But Indonesia, big country, fourth largest population in the world. People don't talk about Indonesia much. It's the next Brazil. It's a really important place. And Malaysia, of course, has also seen massive growth. And there's also this way in which some of these countries in this group are attracting very significant numbers of international students. Obviously, China, which is putting scholarships out in Africa, and right through the BRI, Belt and Road Network. But India is beginning to become a place that people are going to study, and South Korea is quite an important provider of international education, as is Malaysia has been, and has a commercial sector like the British or the Australian system. Malaysia's certainly a player in international education. So, these are non-Western countries. It's a different world. And this is what really shows it, in my view. Scopus, again, not the most inclusive data set, understates the role of the non-Western countries, but the non-Western countries are the majority of scientific output now. So North America, which is so dominant, at 70% of all R&D in the world in 1960, was just in the US alone. Proportion-wise, it's shrinking, although it still produces really important science in many areas. It's proportion-wise, it's not dominant in the way that it was. But the whole West is not as dominant, even though Europe's been seeing tremendous growth in science because of through the Horizon program, through the integrated research projects. It's been very successful, all of that. It's built a great capacity. But Europe, its overall share of the world output is shrinking because of the dynamism of the non-Western countries. And this above all, I should say at the start, it's not just about China, but the China part of the story is really big and important. When you're looking at China, it'll be a couple of years' time, East Asia will outdo North America and Europe taken together. So just East Asia, not the whole of Asia, not Southeast Asia as well, just the Chinese civilizational countries, just that culture. Tremendously as important as Euro-American or Judeo-Christian culture, whatever you want to call it, as important in the world now, and will become maybe larger. And really, in terms of population, in terms of universities and science output, and maybe the cultural influence will follow. The moment you'd say that Korean culture, maybe the one which has impacted the world the most. Japan did too, in the same way with popular culture, and still does. And there's a way to go yet before Chinese civilization or cultures really shape the world the way American culture does right now. So, maybe those things follow rather than lead developments in the economy and in education. But certainly just Japan, China, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Vietnam alone make up this huge block of. So it's no longer a Western world. It's Chile, a duopoly at least, but there's more to it than that. And when does it begin? Well, but Japan did it in the 1970s, 80s, into the 90s. Japan was building a fantastic university system in lots of ways and then stopped funding it, just held funding constant for 20 years, 25 years. And Japan has been marking time in science in lots of ways. But Korea's just seen continuous growth of about 10% per year in papers. And in China, it really begins in the 985 project announcement at Peking University, I think the 5th of May, 1998. And at that point, the state says, we are going to create a layer of world-class universities, which the leading universities have been asking for about 10 years. They'd already thought of it, of course. And they were bringing in American advisors to help them build their capacity in the 80s and early 90s. But the state said, yeah, let's do this. This is going to help us in all kinds of ways. And they set out to build a system which is as strong or stronger than the US. And US examples were powerful in shaping things, but the whole point was to develop China's own capacity, not to borrow science from outside. And in 1998, the funding starts to go like that. It's no longer going up quite the same rate now. And that funding in 1998 onwards was paying for the immense expansion of higher education participation, which is now at the American level about 78%. America's 79%, I think, gross tertiary enrollment ratio. And was funding size at the same time. So China built quantity and a mass higher education system of good quality with several tiers, but especially strong in the top tier, and arguably too hierarchical, too elitist in the way it's been framed. Not enough ballast maybe in the middle, but not neglected entirely. The middle has been funded. At the same time as building quantity, it built science and research quality, and first got everyone researching, got it funding everyone to research, and then lifted that year by year so that it reached the North American level. There's nothing comparable to it in human history. It's like the space race between the Soviet Union and the US and putting people on the moon and so on, which is extraordinary. It's just amazing when you look at it. China's building of science is on that scale. It's kind of, it's amazing. There's only one other case like it, and that's Singapore. Singapore, those two universities, Nanyang and National University of Singapore, are now as strong or stronger than the Americans, except maybe MIT. And so when you look at where the best research has been done, the high citation research, I mean, I say best research, I mean, that's it. Citation's a poor measure. It's a recognition measure rather than proving anything about quality directly, but it does tell you something. Very large research systems tend to cite themselves. So the US and China, the US helps US researchers and the China's help Chinese researchers. So this helps to boost China's position because it's such a big system. But nonetheless, you have to be good enough to be cited. And what's now happened is that Harvard's still the biggest producer of high citation science. Trump has not yet brought it to its knees that far, but then Zhejiang, Tsinghua, where I'm connected, we all thought that Tsinghua was going to end up number 2, but Zhejiang is bigger and quite a lot bigger actually. It's got a very big new international campus, very nice campus in Hangzhou, and it's come in at number 2, and Shanghai Jiaotong, which is very large, it's come in at number 3, and then Tsinghua. And then you get Stanford number 5, and this measure favors large universities. MIT is not very large, and it's about 20th now, but it used to be well up in this list. 10 years ago, it was almost all American. Now it's mostly Chinese. And the big other Anglophone universities like UCL and Toronto, which is a little bit down. I know Toronto's on the second bottom. and Oxford are still in that list as well because they're large. And then when you look at in specific course areas, physical sciences and engineering, it's much the same table in maths. They're all from China. You can't see the very bottom of that table there, but it's China. Every university in that list is now China. Just below, there's National University of Singapore and Nanyang. So they've now fallen out of the top 14, which is this is the top 14, but they're very strong as well. And there's, I think, the first American is MIT, and it's well down. It's about 20th. So, yeah, wow, it all happened very fast. And things don't change that quickly in universities. So this is really unusual, historically. So, yeah, East Asia's arrived. You've probably got that message now about 10,000 times from me in this presentation. East Asia has arrived. And, of course, this has promoted a tremendous political reaction in the US. And, I mean, there's this extraordinary change in American policy. I don't know, has anyone read the latest national strategy document, the one that came out in the Trump national strategy document, and all these wisdoms about what America's going to do in the different parts of the world and so on? I really recommend reading it. It's really scary and very direct, and they're actually doing it. So, one of the things they talk about, of course, is China. And it's interesting to see when you read that, I think they were being more circumspect, not as aggressive, not as anti-China as they usually are. The major emphasis was on the Latin American world and the American hemisphere in general, including Greenland, and saying this is America, this is what our part of the world, and we're in charge here, we do what we want, and any other big power that tries to muscle into Latin America, their days are numbered. So lots of warnings about what happened in Venezuela, basically, and that kind of thing, and what's going to happen in Cuba, presumably. The major thrust of the American policy has been the big turn in relation to China. Until 2015, very high level of positive engagement between China and the US. China still wants that. I mean, you go onto China's universities and so are the Americans coming back? Will they change their mind? I said, no, not for 20 or 30 years. I don't think so. They seem pretty adamant that they want to keep you down. That, of course, is partly a response to the data I just showed you. It's too late. Genie's out of the bottle. I mean, it's maybe 15 years too late. But the US is on this course. Okay, that's the China-America part of it. What about the rest of the world? Well, this is where it gets a bit different and a bit more interesting, I think, because you already knew about that stuff. Well, how you count science really matters. So that when there's the standard Web of Science collection. Now, I'm going to give you data just on social science, but the patterns are the same for all science. The standard Web of Science collection is SSCI in social science. Publishing an SSCI paper is the goal for people all over the world. But the SSCI collection is a lot smaller than everything else around. So the inclusion is more limited to what you might call global metropolis, the US, Western European journals, and their institutions that are dominating those through the editorial boards and through authorship. When you go to Scopus, which comes out a little bit later, it comes out about 25 years after Web of Science, it's more inclusive and has more journals from more regions. It has more journals which are not, I suppose, coming from North America, Western Europe. And then you go to Open Alex. Open Alex has come in and had a big impact. Leiden ranking, the best ranking, the only good ranking, in my opinion, because it's sound data-wise, the only good ranking of universities in the world is using Open Alex now to compare universities to each other. Open Alex has a much bigger set of non-English language stuff from regions outside the West, and much more in Europe than the other two. In fact, I mean, you can see the language figures there. That's very important. Probably more than half of the published knowledge in the world is not in English. So OpenAlex is picking up only 35% is in non-English languages, and that's considerably lower than the real out there. But SSCI Web of Science has only got 2.5% outside English. So it's very clear. It's the bias there. It's the non-European script, like writing in Thailand or the Russian, or of course all the East Asian scripts. They're underrepresented substantially in all databases. So the position of China is considerably underestimated in the data. The real position of China is much stronger, and the position of Korea is stronger as well. I saw a interesting paper which looked at people with Chinese names wherever they were living or affiliated, and found that almost half of all journal papers published in the world have Chinese names. So there you are. But anyway, we've got a situation where we've got a small collection called Web of Science, which still has the major credibility. Got a larger collection called Scopus, which is the one which those of us who do these kind of comparisons have usually used because it's more inclusive. And now you've got OpenAlex, and it's got a lot more. It's got 8 times as much as SSCI in social science in the 2010s, and even the proportion is much the same for the last 5 years too. So OpenAlex is good. So we're using OpenAlex whenever we can now. OpenAlex, a lot more regional journals, as I said, lots more non-West stuff. Now, what happens when you've got Web of Science is that it's because of its Euro-American bias, it's picking up papers which have authors from the non-West, but they tend to be papers which are senior authored in the West. So they make the non-West people look in a dependent position, second author position. Whereas once you go to OpenAlex, you see these same people in their regional context or just a bigger set of journals where they're playing a larger role. You suddenly realize that they're not all in a dependent context at all. And that changes, the importance of it. The classic case is Latin America. Now, Latin America, people have stuck to their guns. They talk to each other academically. They publish in Spanish and Portuguese. They haven't gone with the global rankings game. They've got irritated by rankings considerably because they subordinate Latin America, trash it basically, because they don't publish enough in English to be strong in global rankings. But in fact, when you take into account what's being done in Spanish and Portuguese, it's a completely different picture. It's a large, vibrant output, and OpenAlex underestimates some Spanish and Portuguese to some extent. It doesn't have all of it there, but more than 2/3 of the papers from Latin America and the Caribbean are in Spanish and Portuguese in OpenAlex. So you can see how important that dimension is. And when you include that stuff, you find that Latin America is not far short of the US and Canada in size of output. Latin America, just Latin America and the Caribbean, 12% of what's being published in OpenAlex, and the US, Canada, 17%. So you can see how big and important it is once you start bringing these other databases. Africa, however, there's not a good story here to tell about Africa, but I suppose the overall position of the world is better than we thought, but our instincts that Africa is subordinated still are right. And Africa is publishing less than 4%. That's taken into account all African countries, MENA countries in the north, as well as the South Africa and everyone in between. Get to break that down further in a minute. Just the importance of the regional dimension. And OpenAlex is very helpful here. It shows us that there's much more regional collaboration within regions, Asia, Latin America, Africa, Europe, and Eurasia, which is Central Asia and Russia, than was the Web of Science type data will show us. There's a lot more regional collaboration, and people collaborate because they have languages in common, because they're geographically proximate, because they have cultural similarities and so on. And maybe similar experiences. Colonialism is one of the things that plays out here. Obviously, that's in Latin America, that's quite important. And regions are stronger. The regional dynamic is strongest when there is, I suppose, a close cultural affinity. Doesn't always work, because Pakistan and India, really bad rates of collaboration. That's politics intervening with. I mean, Pakistan and India should be the same country. There's no, and the Punjab has been divided in this totally arbitrary way, and got families on both sides of the divide, and well, historically anyway. But because of politics, people in Pakistan don't collaborate with people in India, and vice versa. But normally, that kind of cultural affinity would lead to relatively intensive rates of collaboration. So the case has to be pretty bad geopolitics to stop it happening. And so Latin America, natural, Central Asia is another one where you've got a lot of commonality between the countries, even though there's different languages. But there's lots of similarities and a similar colonial experience with Russia. So there's that is a mobilizing, a blending thing. And of course, in Europe, you've got this tremendous regional dynamic, which is structured into the EU systems and through into the research system, and the university cooperation is profound as a result of that. In Africa, it's a little bit different, and we're probably talking about sub-regions, but there is a regional dynamic as well, as you know. What's interesting, though, is that is how do we assess regional collaboration in these data? Now, one way is to look at the intensity of cross-regional co-authorship and the intensity of citation of each other's work. If there's a high proportion of citations going to others in the region, there's a regional orientation. But if most of the citations that people are making are going outside the region, then their regional orientation is less strong, and so on. If there's a high rate of collaboration of all the papers being published, many of them are regional collaboration papers, we know that there's an important regional dynamic at work there for that reason as well. But if people are collaborating outside the region primarily, it's not as strong, perhaps, as some other relationships might be. So collaboration and citation data have something to tell us about regionalisation. I'll come back to that. Okay, let's go to the point. Well, I mean, Africa's shared in general growth of science. Interesting to look at these 4 cases. India, until 2010, didn't really take off, and then suddenly starts to pick up, like participation in tertiary education has picked up. It's now at around about 36%. And in the last, I suppose, 10 years or last 8 years, India has grown rapidly in science. So India is still a country which is classified as low income, but of course has a large middle class and pockets of urban wealth and so on, and some strong universities in the middle of it all. It's a complicated beast, but basically it's certainly now a player in science. In South America, again, we're looking at Scopus data here, not OpenAlex. If we had OpenAlex, South America's position would be somewhere there, because the OpenAlex data are 2/3 in Portuguese and Spanish. But in the Scopus data, the proportion's less than 20%. The other one I'd point to here is Indonesia. It's just nowhere. There's obviously nothing going on at all. And then 12 years of growth. And it's taking off. And this little dip at the end is just a data effect. The 2022 data I'm using here, not fully comprehensive. Once we've got 2024 data, this will have turned up again, and then 24 will be a bit down. There's a delay, there's a lag factor in the data, not affecting Africa as much. It's certainly affecting South America and Indonesia. But I think you can assume that Africa will probably grow a bit more, and India's grown a bit more than the data show just there. But anyway, I guess it puts it in proportion. You're talking about 94,000 papers for the continent, the whole continent, including Egypt and South Africa, which are the strong areas. And and that's about, it's about 10% of what China's pumping out, and it's about a quarter of what the US does. This is where it is, and I marked in yellow the countries where you could say there's definitely an established science system. I think the number of papers is a dead giveaway on this. If you've only got 400 research papers a year, then they're probably been published through the doctoral relationships I talked about before with people now in China or in Europe or America doing PhDs, and that's co-publication with their supervisors. But when you've got 1,000 papers, there's something going on. There's universities and research institutes with sufficient local capacity and research to put out research papers from the country concerned. So you can say this tells us where the research systems are in Africa. And I suppose you've got 12: Algeria, Cameroon, Egypt, Ethiopia. Ethiopia's a very poor country, which has got established universities that are relatively strong compared to its economic position. Ghana, where there's quite a number of universities. Kenya, Morocco, Nigeria, of course, its size, its importance. South Africa, Tanzania, Tunisia, and Uganda. Tunisia and Morocco, relatively strong in North Africa, and Algeria not as strong, but in the same, I suppose, cultural zone, and they're working together a lot, those three countries, and with Egypt also, and into Saudi and the West Asian countries in the Arab world. So that's one sub-region, isn't it? The North African Arab-speaking countries are a sub-region, and they have very close cooperation in research data. But there's really two standouts in the whole of Africa. There's Egypt, obviously, because of the size, number of universities, and so on. And there's South Africa, again, number of universities who figure in the research data. A big fish culturally in the world of higher education, and in the world of foreign aid for education in Africa. South Africa is such an important nexus, isn't it? A sort of nub of those activities. But there is capacity. There's capacity in the continent, in these countries at least. And yet, when you look at the overall international data for all regions of the world, it's like the smaller European countries rather than the large ones. This is where, using back to OpenAlex, fortunately, and this is working through Leiden, and this shows us where the strong universities are in the continent. And what jumps out, you look down the system columns, is that South Africa, Egypt really dominate this list of universities. And it's not till towards later on that you get to Uganda, Ghana, certainly, and Morocco, a number of universities in Morocco in this table, 3. Nigeria kicks in. When you go below the level of this first 30, the next 20 or 30, you get Nigeria playing a much larger role further down the list. You see various countries come in later down. Even Rwanda, Zambia, Botswana, Tanzania, Zimbabwe are in the top 100 in terms of research output, but right at the end of the table. But I think a research system needs strong universities. We all of us felt ambivalent about this because, the whole world-class university thing is a bit scary, isn't it? Because it concentrates status power in a small number of institutions. And if they're being built at the expense of all the other institutions, that's a problem. If, however, there's a healthy system development with some concentration in top institutions, but also good second-tier institutions underneath that, and there's a lot of feed between the two, with the top institutions stimulating activity in the second tier providing talent and so on into the top, then you've got a healthier research ecosystem. And you need concentration to extent in science to maximise, I guess, the impact of what everyone is doing. So top universities are important, and it's important for a country with a research system to have universities which are sufficiently large in terms of output. So that's where you would start to build more in Africa. Would be these places would be very important. So what can we find out about regional co-authorship and cross-regional citation, and what does that tell us about the region? Well, I mean, high rates of external co-authorship, with international researchers outside the region it's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, say the European research area, they collaborate with each other furiously across borders. So they have high rates of external collaboration in terms of international. If you're looking at cross-regional, though, their collaborations are more modest outside Europe, which is interesting. The American system always well networked everywhere. So in their case, external network is probably a positive sign of their kind of role in the world. On the other hand, in a system which doesn't have much capacity of its own, it may be depending on international collaboration alone to build its capacity. That would not be a strong form of externalization. So, it's an ambiguous thing. When you're weak, I suppose, a high level of externality is a questionable. If you're building good local activity and good neighbouring links in your region, that's probably a good thing. On the other hand, to be without external collaboration and without internal collaboration as well would, obviously bad. So you have to look at the whole mix, the whole of collaboration patterns. I don't think collaboration data are much help, to be perfectly frank, but they tell us a little bit. The citation recognition data are very useful, though. I think that tells us that there's a regional orientation or not. Well, there's strong regional orientation in South Africa and Nigeria. In those places, scientists are working well in Africa with others. In South Africa because of its leadership role, Nigeria because of its emerging leadership role, I think in lots of ways. In terms of external collaboration, Tunisia, Morocco, Egypt, all collaborating heavily outside the region in the Arab-speaking world. Case of Ghana, Kenya, Tanzania, I think you see the old colonial links still working. Uganda, and to some extent, it's into the Anglophone world.
Saying that, between South Africa and Nigeria, they are citing each other more, or you mean they're being cited more?
No, they're citing more. That means that researchers working in Nigeria are using work from Africa more than most other countries do. Yeah, so there's more, if you like, engagement with work being done in other African countries. I think that's really healthy, and that's it's a good sign that Nigeria is playing that role. Overall, regional co-authorship in Africa is not going up. In all the other regions of the world, regional co-authorship is increasing. More and more work is being done with people in the same region. The region I use here, Asia, is far too large and heterogeneous, and includes, East Asia, which is so obviously dynamic. There's emerging Vietnam as well. There's and then there's Southeast. There's Indonesia, Malaysia. Then there's Myanmar, which is got heaps of problems and not doing very much in science. And then there's Pakistan and Bangladesh, which are really poor and have sub-Saharan African levels of participation in tertiary education, and are not nearly as strong as India now in terms of universities and science. And then there's also in the Asia data, there's West Asia, which is, this strange mix of, really rich Gulf countries and poorer countries like Jordan. And so it's The Asia category is not very helpful, but there's a lot of within Asia cooperation. Obviously, there's lots of it. It's increasing in Europe, it's increasing in Latin America, but in Africa, it's not. In Africa, there's been a decline in the co-authorship across Africa, but actually, when you look at the data, it's solely driven by a decline in South Africa. South Africa's been doing more external non-African collaboration compared to what it did before. Other countries haven't changed very much their overall pattern of collaboration. But regional collaboration is low in Africa compared to other regions. In-region citations fairly low as well. The really worrying thing is that citation of by the rest of the world into African work is low. And there's far more African citation of work from outside Africa than there is work outside Africa using Africa. That's a bad sign, and that's the thing you'd want to see improving. Interesting patterns, though. There's obviously more collaboration and citation activity between Asia, mostly East Asia, I think, but not only East Asia, Southeast Asia, a bit, Malaysia, Indonesia as well. But obviously China and the Belt and Road stuff and the scholarships and the large number of African students now studying in China, all of that's influencing. I see that as a journal editor, we just get more and more articles now coming from, and much improved, I must say, in terms of standard in the last 5 years, coming from African students or recent graduates working with Chinese supervisors. So there's sort of double authorship. Usually the African student is first. And there's also, of course, the MENA links with so much going on between Egypt and Saudi Arabia, for example. That's a cross-regional collaboration technically, but if you say the Arab region is a region, Arab-speaking region is a region, of course, it makes more sense. So overall pattern, well, not a Western world anymore. You tell that to the British and they won't quite understand you yet, but it's not. And people in the West are very slow to grasp this. And I think it explains a lot. The anxiety about it, though, explains a lot of the populist kickback. The world's changing. It's not a Western world anymore. The colonial peoples have suddenly become equals, and here they are, working harder than us. What are we going to do? That's kind of tough, isn't it, for people who are not used to it, but also people who don't have many options themselves. A lot of racist pushback can be explained, I think, by this, I suppose, inversion of the old power structures at a global level, or at least the changing. Inversion might be too strong a word. It's not a Western world anymore. And in science, it's a North American, European, and Asian world rather than a solely Western. Obviously, the East Asian Centre is really important and gets bigger and bigger. Long term, it becomes the strongest zone in the world. I think there's no question of that, although the US remains very important as well. And Europe, stronger than it was in research and science than at any previous stage in history before about the Second World War, anyway, until before the Second World War. It's getting stronger, not weaker. So very interesting. So you've got these three strong zones, and you've got Latin America stronger, and even Russia, Central Asia stronger than the data in Web of Science tell us. And on the whole, the non-Western regions are more autonomous in terms of topics of the work and in terms of their citing of each other and collaborating with each other than we thought. Stronger national systems than we thought in most of the world. Only Africa is as yet not fully sharing in this dynamic. There's signs of it beginning, but it's not yet like Latin America. This is where you know more than me about what's needed. But from my higher education studies vantage point, I would say you've got to have continuity in state policy. You've got to have a willingness to build universities and science over 10, 20 years. That, of course, is the great success of China and Singapore, that they have this long-term outlook. It's hard to do that. It's culturally, not everyone's like that. The rest of the world's not like that, but certainly a longer time frame than a 3-year period in power or a 5-year period in power is necessary. A commitment to a project which goes on beyond the current leadership into the next generation of national leadership and so on. So it's about state building, and it's about long-term vision in higher education and science. And the system's already there, but it's a matter of building them up to make them much stronger over a time period. So they need stability. So the institutions need stability. They need to be, their leadership needs to be not just political appointments that are constantly changing and they're just a prize for whoever's in power, the families of who are in power, but become professionally appointed and sustainable over a longer period. Probably the most important single thing, though, is building mass tertiary education, because mass tertiary education provides the institutions, the infrastructure, and it provides all the economies of scale that can underpin research and teaching nexus and sufficient academic staff and so on, so to sustain so many of the best people in Africa who get PhDs are going abroad because there's not the opportunities at home, there's not the state salary structure at home, there's not the stability of careers at home. But if those people were staying or coming back, then of course it's a different situation. And so, but you need the infrastructure to employ them. So you need the budgets. Can't get away from it. And that again requires state building of physical capacity and commitment to longer term view. All those things are working better in some countries than others, as you know. But the other one's regional identity, isn't it? And there's awful lot of talk about it in the region, but but it does matter, doesn't it? And I think the complication is the sort of cultural factor, you know, that MENA is in one place, sub-Saharan Africa is in another place. And there's differences between West and East Africa as well. So, I mean, I think the commitment to Africa would have to be primary for everyone for it to really, for the regional dynamic to really work. Regional identity has to be primary. And that's what Latin America has. You know, it has that sense of a shared project of we're the global South and we're not Europe anymore, but we've come from that. That's our heritage, you know. And the common religion probably helps tie that together, and the languages. So they're two big things they've got working for them. But identity is always hard to define, always hard to work out how you sustain it when it's not there. But it really is crucial to building a regional approach. Maybe Africa's too big and too diverse to be a region in the same sense as, say, Europe is. It's larger, more culturally disparate, certainly. But it has a common experience of colonialism, and I think that might be the most important single element. It's certainly been the thing which has welded Latin America together more tightly. That's all I have to say. Thank you for listening. That's the commercial for my book, which is just comes out tomorrow officially, but it's been out online for about 3 or 4 weeks.